Good day, everybody. Thank you all for once again joining us in our webinar series. We're glad to have you here, especially if you were on the first session and you still came back for the second one. We'll take that as even a greater vote of confidence for us. In the first session, we were talking about going ahead and getting out into the marketplace to find the employee that you need. Now, we're operating under the assumption you've identified that candidate, you're bringing them on board for that first day of work, and you're trying to position them for success in your operation as you go forward. So what are some of the things that you need to think about as you get that employee on board and try to make them an integrated part of your operation? That's what we're going to talk about today. So as soon as I figure out how to get my slides advancing here. There we go. And yes, that is the British version of the office, which I figured if there was a fun place to work, surely that would be it, right? So how do you keep those employees thinking that it's fun to work on your farm? Now, as a predicate to what we're about to talk about today, there is a question we have to ask ourselves, and it may seem obvious or it may be completely non-obvious to you. But one thing you need to ask yourself is the person that's working for me actually my employee? And what we mean by that is, are they our employee or are they an independent contractor? And lots of times in agriculture, we like to say that a person is, in agriculture, we like to say a person is an independent contractor because that means we have a lot less responsibility for them. But that's not always the way that it works out. We actually have to ask ourselves some legitimate questions to figure out, is this person truly an independent contractor? Well, how do you tell the difference? First off, if you're an employee, you're given a lot of oversight and instruction. You get very specific instructions about how, when, and with what equipment you're supposed to perform the work. If you're an independent contractor, basically you're given an outcome. Think about the example of a custom harvester. Go, cut this crop, put it in the bin. You care more about an outcome than specifically how it's done. So that's one distinction. Another is, are the person using the tools that you've provided them, or are they bringing their own equipment to the table? If it's using something that you already own, odds are that person looks more like an employee. If they're providing their own equipment, it looks more like an independent contractor. The level of supervision and training that's provided, the more we have of that, the more the person looks like an employee. If we assume that they're bringing all the necessary skills to the table already, they look more like an independent contractor. If the employee is going to get paid no matter what, and bear in mind that we may eventually terminate the employee if we don't like the quality of the work for long enough, but if we're paying that person on an hourly or weekly, monthly basis, and they're going to get paid regardless of what happens, that's something that looks a lot like an employee. If a person's payment is based solely on performance of the project to a successful conclusion, that looks a lot more like an independent contractor. What are the consequences of that? Well, if someone's our employee, then we're responsible for all the record-keeping requirements at the state level, the federal level, and we're talking about payroll withholding, we're talking about employment records, we're talking about work authorization, documentation, all that. That's something that's going to be the responsibility of the employer. If someone's an independent contractor, the contractor's responsible for all record-keeping. We really don't have anything to do with that. If we're talking about taxes and salaries, all state and federal withholding is going to be the responsibility of the employer with an employee. If the person works more than 40 hours in a week, we've got overtime issues. If someone is working in specific work types, they may be exempt from minimum wage or overtime, but we bear responsibility for that if we're wrong. If someone's an independent contractor, they're responsible for all their taxes. All we have to do, basically, if we've engaged an independent contractor, is we may have to provide them with a 1099 form. That's something you can talk about with your tax professional. If they do something bad and someone's injured, if we incur liability as a result of what they're doing, if we're supervising someone as an employee, the supervisor can actually bear liability as well. That's what we call respondeat superior in the law, which is simply saying that the superior must answer. If you're supervising an employee and the employee does something wrong, the employer has liability for the employee's action. If someone's truly an independent contractor, generally speaking, and I want to underline that, generally speaking, the independent contractor is going to bear responsibility for what they've done, but that doesn't mean that we have an absolute bar to liability on the part of the person that's engaged the independent contractor, especially if the person employing the independent contractor affirmatively knew that what they were doing was wrong and kind of purposefully turned a blind eye towards that. So those are some of the consequences of knowing, is this person an independent contractor, or are they an employee? So for the rest of today's presentation, we're going to be focusing on people that we've engaged as an employee, someone that really has an employer-employee relationship with us. So with that, we turn to getting that new person on the job. Once we've hired that person and they're showing up for the first day, we need to collect all the employee information that we'll need to have for our record-keeping requirements. And those record-keeping requirements, by the way, are going to be detailed in the handbook that we'll be making available at the end of the project. But one thing that we'll talk about in some detail today is the Form I-9 process. How do we document that this person is legally authorized to be in the United States and working? You'll also have them fill out a Form W-9 so that you'll know the proper tax withholding to complete, as well as getting payroll information, Social Security numbers, determining withholding allowances, determining salary rates, all those good things that we need to collect on that first day of the job, as well as contact information, which might seem pretty obvious, but you'd be surprised how often this is overlooked. We need to make sure that we know how to get a hold of this person regularly, how to get a hold of them if there's an emergency, and how we need to get a hold of them if we need to send something via mail. Remember, as we talked about in last week's seminar, if you're hiring someone new, you're probably going to have new employee hire reporting requirements no matter what state you're in, because it's a federal requirement. It just usually gets delegated to states. And the purpose of new hire reporting is, A, to make sure that information is in all the state databases, but also B, to make sure that if there are any outstanding child support obligations, that person's information is recorded so that that can be handled appropriately by the authorities. If we need to have any workplace notices, and you've probably all seen the posters at the post office or some other place of employment, especially in federal offices, the posters that provide all of the requirements of the Fair Labor Standards Act, the Occupational Safety and Health Act. All those federal reporting notices are usually on posters. Make sure all those are posted if you have enough employees to require those. Well, let's get down to the I-9 process. And I-9 is something that's misunderstood quite a bit. So let's demystify that a little bit. When we're talking about the I-9 process, all we're trying to determine is, can our employee legally work in the United States? And that's pretty much it. It's very important, though, that you complete the I-9 process for every employee. No matter if you've known them their entire life or not, make sure you have an I-9 on file for every employee that you have. The I-9 requirement applies to anyone who has an employee. So if you just have one employee, you're required to complete the I-9 process. Excuse me, I apologize for that. I-9 is very good for you in that it provides you a very solid defense. If for whatever reason it turns out that that person wasn't authorized to work in the United States, if you've properly completed the I-9 process and done your due diligence with it, you've done everything that you really can as an employer to determine that person's workplace eligibility. So that's a very good thing for us. It's also important to note that you need to have I-9 forms retained on site in case there is an inspection for your property. And I-9 is also very important to conduct on the first day of work, not before, especially not during the interview process. And lots of people get confused about that. The reason that you want to complete the I-9 form on the first day of employment is so that you can document that there was no national origin-based discrimination in offering that person employment. You don't give yourself access to any of that information until the person has reported for work on their first day. Similarly, if you complete I-9 and you find out the person is not documented to work, you do not have to retain that person. As a matter of fact, if you knowingly employ someone who's not authorized to work, you could get into some serious trouble there. However, that does not mean that you have an affirmative obligation to report that person to Immigrations and Customs Enforcement. It just means that you need to terminate the employer-employee relationship. So how do you complete I-9? It's actually very straightforward. There's two sections on the form that you care about. Section 1 is completed by the employee. Now, if the person needs assistance, you can provide them assistance and you can document that on the form. Section 2 is completed by the employer. Basically, in Section 1, the employee is describing the information that they have to provide for you to know whether or not they're legally authorized to work in the United States. Section 2 then is completed by you, the employer. That's you authenticating that you've reviewed that information and found, yes, that that person is eligible for work in the United States. Remember, you don't have to send that form in to anyone. You just retain that for yourself, and you'll have it on site in case there is an inspection and you need it down the road. When you're completing I-9 with the employee is going to have to provide documentation of their eligibility to work. And they do that in two ways. They can provide something off of List A. List A is a list of documents that establish both who that person is and that they're authorized to work in the United States. And the classic example of a List A document is a United States passport. That United States passport indicates that you're a U.S. citizen, and it has a photograph on there that is constituting a government-issued photo ID. So that meets all the criteria. Just a passport will do it for you. If you don't have something from List A, and by that way there are other List A documents besides just a passport, then you have to provide one item from List B and one item from List C. It's not two from B, not two from C. There's got to be one from B and one from C. Items on List B establish identity. Those are usually government-issued ID cards. For example, a driver's license is a classic example of that one. List C documents are documents that establish employment authorization. Classic example of a List C document is a Social Security card. Remember, you can't specify what document they provide on that list. It just has to be one of the documents from B, one of the documents from C. Also, if you're using E-Verify, and E-Verify is simply an online electronic system that enables you to get instant verification that an employee is eligible to work. It's a very good system if you do any sort of frequency of employment. You know, I'd suggest looking into E-Verify to see if it'd be something that would make your life a little bit easier. But E-Verify employers can only accept List B documents with a photograph, so it has to be a government-issued photo ID there. Now, you may be asking yourself, okay, someone shows me a driver's license, someone shows me a Social Security card, but how am I supposed to authenticate that? How am I supposed to know if that's real or fake? There are two basic rules for this. Number one, does the document reasonably appear genuine? In other words, if we pulled, a dozen people off the street and they looked at the document that was handed to you, would most of those people say, yeah, that looks like it's real? And number two, does the document reasonably appear to relate to the person presenting it? In other words, do the names match up? Are the names that the person told you the name of the person's ID? We're not saying that you have to be some sort of forensic scientist here. All we're saying is, would the average person be able to look at those documents and say, yeah, they look real, and they look like they are connected to the person that actually handed them to me? That's all you have to do, really. If you get something that looks like this, okay, maybe it's time to ask a few questions there, right? So really, we're just talking about would the average person know whether or not these documents are authentic or not. So once we've got the person on board, we've done all the paperwork, we're prepared for our tax withholding and our I-9 documentation, we should probably actually teach this person something about the things we expect them to do. And yet so often in agriculture we overlook that. And really, when you're talking about training experiences for your new ag employee, it's a lot like just being a good teacher for someone. And to help you with that is someone who's actually gotten a few awards for being a good teacher. That's Dr. Rod Jones. Rod, over to you.
Yeah, we're going to lead you through a little bit of the training process and then on to some of the next steps associated with bringing a new employee on board. Training is a process of learning how to do things in order to maximize that employee's contribution to the business or the overall organization. And remember, new employees are never, I repeat that, never going to bring with them all of the knowledge and skills and abilities that they need to do the job now and in the future. So this training process represents an investment in the future of the overall business and the success of the overall business. However, it is one aspect of the employment process that many agricultural employees, I've just seen many examples of failures in this regard, including some on our own family business. Learning how to do this and how to do it well is a process. One common mistake is turning new employees loose with no training whatsoever. So if a new employee does something crazy or completely inappropriate but hasn't been trained on how to do it right, that's nobody's fault but the boss's. Another common mistake is to allow a new employee to be trained by another employee who is themselves not prepared to do an effective training job. Now, this could be because they don't know how to do the job very well themselves. Hopefully that would not be the case. Or it could be somebody who is actually very good at doing the job, but is just not very good at explaining how to do the job to somebody else. So either one of those instances could result in a shortcoming in the training process. So to set the stage here, again, new employees need trained even if they come from, say, for example, a neighboring farm, if there's someone you've known all their life, if they've grown up in your community. They may know a little bit about agriculture. They may even know a little bit about the agriculture in your particular geographic region or your particular set of enterprises that you have on your farm or ranch, but they don't know your farm. They don't know your equipment. They don't know your way of doing stuff. So even in the best of circumstances, employees need training. So here's a simple step-by-step process, and the reason that we illustrate this process is because it's been proven time and time again to work. It took me quite a while to learn this process and learn how to implement it effectively. I've had some failures in training employees on our farm, and I've had some successes, and I'm just here to share with you personally that implementing this process works, and it works well, and it helps to avoid or lessen the consequences of some bad employee experiences. So here are the steps. Number one, make sure the employee is at ease with the particular task or the particular piece of equipment that you're trying to train them to operate. That means have we talked about it ahead of time? Have we given them any reading or preparation material that is needed to allow them to get more comfortable with the environment, with the particular set of equipment that we're asking them to operate, or whatever the case may be. And along with that, preparing the workplace. Is the equipment in good working order? Or if there are some quirks or some idiosyncrasies with a particular piece of equipment that we're asking them to operate that we haven't been able to get completely resolved yet, are we prepared to fully explain to that particular employee how we get around any issues that might come up as they work with that particular piece of equipment or in that particular situation? So prepare the workplace, and a lot of times that means just making sure the equipment's in good order, things are where they need to be so that they can be found, so that the employee can do the job. Step number two, explain very thoroughly to the employee how you want the task done and the operations involved and how you want those operations done. How do I want the corners worked out when I'm working this field? What order do I want this set of livestock to be fed, or whatever the case may be. Step number three, walk through the process with the employee. Show the employee how the task is to be performed. Now, in most modern farm equipment, that task has become a lot easier in the last 20 years or so, because they're now, of course, putting buddy seats on all equipment. Unlike how used to be the case, it's a lot easier to actually have an employee sit there in the seat beside you while you go about the task of performing an operation and show them how it's to be done, because of that convenience that's been added to most equipment. In other situations, you have to figure out ways that work to show the employee how to do the particular task at hand. And then the next step, of course, is let the employee do the task under your supervision, either switching seats in the piece of equipment, for example, or you step out of the piece of equipment and just remain there in the field and watch the employee do the job, or whatever the case may be. Let the employee do the task and then review the work with them to make sure that they're doing it correctly. Again, efforts to short circuit this process certainly are attractive in that we're all busy and gosh, we just don't have time to effectively train this employee. But sometimes lessons are learned the hard way when we try to short circuit this time-tested process of training new employees. I think the bottom line is take the training process little steps at a time to avoid big disasters. That's kind of my motto here lately as I train various employees to do various things on our farming operation. Next thing I want to talk about is making sure that we have communicated clear performance expectations. Remember, the goal is to steadily move toward making the business operate smoothly and efficiently and effectively. So performance expectations, the employee, in order to be a part of that process, a part of achieving that goal, the employee has to know what is expected of them and then know periodically if they are meeting those expectations. So we need to convey to the employee periodically what those performance expectations are, discuss it with the employee, and agree on what those expectations are and how those expectations have either been met or we've fallen short of meeting those expectations in the past. This should be a two-way process where there's a lot of communication. We're back to this communication thing that we talked about quite a bit last week. So there are two ways of communicating performance expectations to an employee. There are informal ways where expectations are not necessarily written down, not clearly communicated. Feedback is very sporadic, often only when it's negative feedback. No formal annual appraisal. In other words, a very informal process of communicating performance expectations. And then there's the formal process where expectations are clearly written down. There's very frequent, I would suggest daily, back and forth communication, back and forth feedback, and a periodic, the suggestion would be at least annual, a periodic formal review that's oriented more toward the future and less toward the past. So let's elaborate on that just a little bit. Some advantages of clearly written performance expectations, of course, are going to allow the manager and the employee to discuss and agree upon expected performance, and they also serve as a permanent record that can be referred to from time to time through the appraisal period. Here's what we agreed that would be done, and here's how we're moving forward to make that happen. Like goals in general, performance expectations are very similar to a goal. They are, in a way, a goal. So performance expectations, if they're written down, they need to be in some way, shape, or form measurable. In other words, we know whether we accomplished it or not, either yes or no, that's measurable, or a number associated with it. I expect you to get this done 10 times every week, and we either did it 10 times every week or we didn't do it 10 times every week. Goals and performance expectations need to have a time frame associated with them. When are we going to make it happen? By what date is this going to happen? And performance expectations, like short-term goals, need to be something that is within a reasonable range of being achievable by a normal person working in this environment. We don't want to set performance expectations that are far beyond what anybody could reasonably be expected to achieve. So those are just some simple guidelines about written performance expectations. Let's talk a little bit about motivation. Motivation is the willingness to put forth effort in pursuit of goals based on individuals' wants and needs. In other words, what makes a person tick? What makes a person want to do something? If we can accept the fact that motivation comes from within each of us individually, then the role of a manager becomes one of creating a work environment where employees are motivated to pursue their own personal interests, and those interests match up well or synchronize, or there's some commonality between those individual interests and what needs to be done on the job. If we can achieve that level of synchronization, if you will, we have a great employer-employee relationship, because the employee is feeling good, being highly motivated about doing things that are in the best interest of the overall organization. So, what makes people tick? What makes people really want to do something? We typically categorize those motivational factors into two broad general categories. The first we'll call maintenance factors. I want to do something because I'm getting paid to do something, and it makes me feel really good when I get paid, because then I can support my family, buy fun things that I want to buy, and all kinds of economic factors there. Security needs fall into maintenance factors. I want to be secure. I want to be safe. I have some social needs that need to be met. Working conditions, maybe that relates to safety. Maybe there are some status factors that fall into maintenance factors for certain individuals. So all of those we would put in the broad category of maintenance factors. Then there are motivational factors, things that just make us feel good. Things like, I really feel good when somebody presents me with a challenge. I know people like that. I really feel good when I can get something done and see it through to the finish line and feel like I really accomplished something. I know a lot of people like that. Or perhaps it's not just that I feel good because I accomplished it. What makes me feel good is if somebody else recognizes that I got something accomplished, and they let me know that I got that something accomplished. Maybe for me it's constantly achieving a higher level of responsibility or a sense of importance in the organization. Or I also know people, and most of you can think of people like this too, what really makes them tick is if they feel like they know something that not everybody knows. Now, I know that some of us view that as kind of a weird motivational factor, but hey, if that's what makes somebody tick, and if we can take advantage of that, not in a negative way, but take advantage of that in the sense of making that employee more productive, why not? Or involvement in the decision-making process. All of these are well and good, maintenance factors, motivational factors. Of course, the problem is there's not a cookie-cutter solution. Every individual, each one of us, weigh each of these characteristics or factors differently. For some of us, a certain item on that list is very important. For others of us, that same item on the list may not be important at all. Good supervisors, good people managers are really good at figuring out what makes each of their subordinates tick, and managing those characteristics, or managing that array of characteristics or factors targeted toward individual employees is exactly why there's a limit to how many people one manager should directly supervise. And we're not going to get into a discussion or debate about that, but that's exactly why people say there is some upper limit to the number of people that one supervisor should be directly responsible for, because the theory is they need to get to know the people working under them and be able to, so to speak, not in a negative way, but push the right buttons to maximize the performance of each of those individuals working under them. And with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Shannon.
So if you've been following the chat bar, you've seen the discussion that we've had about whether or not an ice chest can actually be part of the rollover protection system for your tractor, which is just one thing that we talk about when we're discussing worker safety on the farm. And yes, worker safety on the farm actually is a big deal, folks. I don't know if you know this or not, but agriculture is the second most dangerous industry in the United States, second only to the mining industry. We have a lot of workplace injuries because we have a hazardous workplace. There's lots of powered equipment, there's lots of dangerous conditions, and so we in agriculture really need to be more careful with our conditions. So let's take a look at the Occupational Safety and Health Act, which then begat the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, or OSHA. Under the OSHA law, every employer is required to provide their employees, and here's the quote here, a place of employment which is free from recognized hazards that are causing or are likely to cause death or serious physical harm to the employees. In other words, if there's a way that we can make a hazardous condition safe, let's try to make it safe. If you have a known quicksand location on your property, maybe try to keep your employees away from that, okay? And one way we can do that in agriculture is to be aware of the OSHA standards for machinery, chemical handling, specifically anhydrous ammonia, and for silos or storage areas that have an oxygen-deficient environment. Those are all things for which OSHA has specific agricultural standards that we need to follow there on the farm. Also understand that there are lots of things that if you're under the age of 16 or under the age of 18 that you shouldn't do on your farm unless, of course, you're working for your parents. If you're working for your parents, the OSHA workplace standards don't apply. But if you're working for anybody else as an employee, you've got to bear that stuff in mind. If you're a kid under the age of 16 and you're working for someone else, you don't get to operate basically any form of powered equipment. You don't get to drive passenger vehicles, which that's kind of a pretty obvious statement there. You don't get to work inside any oxygen deficient atmosphere. So for example, if you have a silo or some other place where there's restricted atmosphere, you don't get to have someone under the age of 16 working there. You don't get to work at heights greater than 20 feet. And of course, you can't handle chemicals or explosives. And the place where we usually find trouble with that is especially in the handling of anhydrous ammonia. Here in Oklahoma, we're in the heart of wheat planting season. Actually, I say that, a lot of our wheat planting is already done here in the state, but lots of anhydrous ammonia tanks going up and down the road, and we can't have kids under the age of 16 handling that stuff and be in compliance with the OSHA rules. There are requirements like we talked about for lots of things. One of the most important requirements is for tractor safety. If you're operating basically any tractor that was manufactured after 1979, you have to have a rollover protection system, ROPS, basically a roll bar. And if you've got a ROPS system in place, that means you need to be using your seat belt as well. So while we're talking about workplace hazards, that kind of naturally leads us to the topic of workers' compensation. And workers' compensation varies a lot from state to state. So what we're going to talk about is how things are handled here in Oklahoma. Oklahoma, for agricultural employers, doesn't require the purchase of workers' compensation insurance if your agricultural payroll is less than $100,000 a year. So for most of our agricultural employers, there's not a requirement to purchase workers' compensation insurance. But if something were to happen on the farm and there be an employee injury, the Workers' Compensation Act could help you out if you do have workers' compensation insurance. In Oklahoma, if you've purchased workers' compensation insurance, the amount of injury recovery that an employee can have is limited to the amount of coverage that you have under your workers' compensation plan. So that means it's something of a liability protection to actually have the workers' compensation insurance in place. Also in Oklahoma, if you don't have workers' compensation insurance, that doesn't mean you don't have to compensate the worker for a workplace injury. And agriculture is not exempt from that, okay? So it's usually in your best interest to actually have some form of workers' compensation insurance in place. It might actually be a fairly low-cost way to mitigate any risk of employee injury on your farm. So now we've dealt with the safety side of things, I'm going to turn things back over to Rod to talk about how you can provide some really valuable feedback to your employees and get the most performance you possibly can.
Well, thank you, Shannon. Let's go back to that feedback thing just a little bit that I talked about a few minutes ago that is so important in terms of keeping employees on track toward making a contribution to the overall organization. Yes, ongoing, perhaps even daily, feedback is critical for employee development, growth, and productivity, leading, of course, to a higher likelihood of business success. Two types of feedback that we can talk about: just ongoing positive feedback, or of course those instances where something might need to be corrected a little bit and we need to implement just a little bit of constructive criticism. So let's talk about reasons why farm managers commonly fail to provide positive feedback. Catch somebody doing something well and let them know about it is one way to think about that issue. Well, we've got a lot of old school managers out there, and again, I don't mean that in a negative way. It's just a tradition, a generational trait that it's not necessary. People should just be expected to do a good job, and I shouldn't have to tell them that they're doing a good job. Well, you know, there may be some truth to that, but it doesn't help us with some of those motivational factors that we talked about earlier that so many people find to be helpful and important. Some managers have a difficult time expressing any feelings. Farmers, ranchers, people in agriculture probably, I would say it's safe to say, did not get into this line of work because they are people persons, quote unquote. We're get things done, take some risk, jump in and do it kind of people. And so just because we think that way as the business owner or the business manager doesn't necessarily mean that all the folks that we have working for us and working with us feel that way. So we may have to step back and learn how to at least express some appreciation when we catch somebody doing something well. And then finally, another point there, some managers related feel that positive feedback will be perceived as insincere. It will just sound like I'm blowing smoke if I'm constantly telling somebody that they're doing a good job. And of course, there would be some truth to that if we take that to the extreme and are in fact telling somebody they're doing a good job when in fact they're not. The whole point is here, identify situations and instances where somebody is doing a good job and let them know, and make it sincere when that happens. Second category, reasons why managers fail to deliver constructive criticism. It's a little harder when you need to change behavior or performance because it quite likely could be an uncomfortable situation. And many managers like to avoid uncomfortable situations, uncomfortable conversations. So again, it depends on the relationship that you have with the individual that you're having the conversation with. It may be uncomfortable if you haven't spent that time building a positive relationship so that you can be honest and straightforward with that person to inspire change. Managers may resist giving negative feedback out of fear of being disliked. Again, it all depends on the depth of that relationship. May fear the employee might resign. In an extreme circumstance, that may be the case, but hopefully, again, it all boils down to relationships and that mutual respect bank account. If we've spent some time building a positive rapport with that employee, they're going to think nothing of us suggesting that, well, you know, a different way to do this job might be do it this way, and that will avoid this problem that's likely to develop if we keep doing it the way it's currently being done. That won't be taken negatively at all if we've developed enough of a positive rapport with that employee to begin with. Again, going back to supervisors, direct supervisors being responsible for only a limited number of people so that they can, in fact, develop those much needed relationships. So, finally, let's talk about that formal, once a year, maybe more frequently than that, performance appraisal. Yes, we all like to joke about our annual performance appraisal. Those of us who are in jobs that have required that for basically all of our career, as many of us are, we jokingly refer to it as our annual devaluation or something like that. All of that in jest, of course, because we recognize the importance of these formal appraisal sessions. So that we can do our job better and be more closely aligned with the goals and objectives of the overall organization. So, some things that have to fall into place. Make sure that the person that you're getting ready to conduct a formal appraisal with knows well in advance that, yes, this is just part of the job, and let's get together Monday morning to go over job expectations and how it's been going for the last 6 months or the last year and what we might need to change. Nothing out of the ordinary here. This is just something we do, and that's why we're going to get together. Start off by asking the employee how do they feel they've been doing in the job. Get some feedback from the employee. And then communicate your views regarding their performance as the supervisor or the manager, and talk about any discrepancies, and quite often there are none. Quite often we can move very directly into developing a plan of action for what we're going to do to make things even better or make some changes for the next appraisal period. What has changed in the organization? Do we need to shift gears a little bit? So those are just some points about feedback and performance appraisal. Back to Shannon.
All right. So one of the things that Rod was talking about, oddly, that motivates people is money. Weird, right? And by the way, it may not be the most powerful motivator in most jobs, but it is important. And hopefully after you listened to our first webinar and kind of developed a human resources plan for your operation, you sat down with your CPA, you sat down with your spreadsheet and your books and said, okay, what can we really afford to pay this employee? So hopefully you've done that work in advance and you know that we can afford to pay them some sort of salary that's commensurate with their skills, that's appropriate to the workplace, appropriate to the marketplace for that employee, and appropriate to the region as well. Now that can be delivered in a number of ways. First off is this good old fixed wages, and you can think of fixed wages as a salary. This person is going to get paid X dollars per week, okay? Some people would characterize a fixed hourly wage in there, although I would probably call it an hourly wage actually more variable if the hours are variable. If someone's always going to be called upon to work a certain number of hours per week, that's okay. But if the wages are variable and perhaps very seasonal, that's something that we need to talk about to the employee and make sure that they understand that. So when we're talking about any form of variable wages, number one, does the employee understand how we're calculating that? I mean, if it's hourly, that's pretty straightforward. You work this many hours, we pay you X number of dollars per hour, so here's your amount of pay. That's okay. But if we have some sort of incentive program that can be variable to the wages that the employee receives, we need to make sure that they understand how that's calculated. And it would probably be a good idea if with each paycheck that they also got a pay statement that explained all of that. Can the employer and the employee objectively calculate the wages? In other words, if you played the newlywed game with employer and employee and made them both separately calculate the wages, would they both be able to come up to the same answer? You want that to be the case because you don't want the employee to have any surprises, and same thing for the employer as well. Lastly, if your employee is going to have some variability in their wages, is that something that's solely in the discretion of the employer? If so, that may be frustrating for them. And again, if we're talking about variable hours, there's some understanding of that, especially if we're talking about the seasonal nature of agricultural labor. But if it's hourly labor that varies a lot, just kind of depending on the whims of the employer, that can set up some harsh feelings between the employer and employee. So we want to make sure that the employer knows what they can and can't control, and that the employee knows what they can and can't control. And especially if we're tying wages to an incentive program, we need to make sure that we're incentivizing behaviors that the employee can have some influence over. If the employee's incentives are based solely on market forces, well, there's really nothing the employee can do about that, and there's some question as to whether there's any value motivationally for having that sort of incentive program in place. But if we're talking about productivity or efficiency, those are things that the employee could have a lot of control over, and that may be something that's valuable as part of an incentive program. No matter what our setup for wages and salaries are, though, we have to remember always the requirements of the Fair Labor Standards Act, or the FLSA. And the basic assumption of the Fair Labor Standards Act is that there are going to be minimum wage and overtime requirements for all employees unless a specific exemption applies, okay? So the assumption is all employees, no matter who they are subject to the FLSA unless there is an exception that gets them out of that. Now, for right now, our federal minimum wage is $7.25 unless your state's higher. Some states do have the option of making their minimum wage higher than the federal standard. And our overtime rules state that if someone who does not have an exception works over 40 hours in a week, they have to be paid 1.5 times their normal wage as overtime. And the Department of Labor is a little bit sensitive to people playing games with this, arbitrarily moving work weeks so that they can manipulate the 40-hour mark. You've got to have a regularly scheduled payroll program, and 40 hours within a week for that program is what defines the limit. Now, agricultural employees can be exempt from minimum wage and overtime if they fit into one of these categories. Number one, did the farm where they were employed use less than 500 man-days of labor last calendar quarter? Does that sound like a mouthful? Yes. Is that tough to figure out? Yeah, it is. Basically, this is just meant to capture larger agricultural employers, and our handbook will have more details about how to calculate the man-day of labor, but for most of us, that's not going to get us. If you're the kid or spouse of the employer, you're not subject to minimum wage and overtime. I'm sorry about that. And as a farm kid, trust me, I can sympathize. If you're engaged in hand harvest labor and are paid on a piece rate basis, you're not subject to minimum wage and overtime under the theory that you have some control over how much you're paid per hour. If you're principally engaged in the range production of livestock. Now, lots of cattle raisers go, aha, that's me. But if you actually read the interpretive cases in this rule, what you'll see is that they're talking about people that are engaged in livestock to such an extent that it would be very difficult for them to know when they're on or off the job. One factor considered in that is whether or not you get to come home every night. If your ranch is so vast that you basically camp out and don't return to headquarters each night, that gets you closer to what we're talking about when we're talking about true range production of livestock here. It's important to note that those are the agricultural exceptions. So if you don't fit into that, and by the way, let me go back in our slides here for just one moment. Oh, sorry. Farm use less than 500 man days, you're the kid or spouse of the employer, you're engaged in hand harvest labor, you're principally engaged in range production of livestock. If you don't fit in any of those, you don't count. And also, if you're working in the farm office, if you're engaged in secretarial or administrative work, and you're not actively involved in production agriculture, meaning you're actually involved with the productive processes, you're not an agricultural employee. If you're working in the office, that does not count. So you're subject to minimum wage and overtime. Now, there are lots of other exceptions to minimum wage and overtime that do apply to administrative and executive workers, but in order to be eligible for that, you have to be paid a salary of at least $47,476 annually. That's a result of a new rulemaking that's been made by the Department of Labor, and it's gotten lots of attention in agriculture. But if you're in an administrative or office role, that's your minimum salary before you're kicked out of the coverage for overtime and minimum wage rules. So if you're an executive employee, that might be exempt. Someone that has hire fire authority or compensation setting authority, or someone that has actual managerial duties. Administrative employees, people that do non-manual work inside the office to support operations of the business, for example, secretarial work might be an example of that. Or outside sales, someone who makes sales outside the principal place of business and that travels frequently with that work, they're also exempt as well. That leads us into fringe benefits, and fringe benefits are something that can actually be a powerful part of your incentive program as long as we tie it to the things that really add value to you intrinsically. So for that, we'll turn things back over to Rod.
Well, farms have a lot to offer in terms of fringe benefits that may be attractive to particularly the type of employee that you may want to recruit to your farming operation. And some of those are on this list, and some of these are just the more standard fringe benefits that any employer can offer. Retirement plans, obviously, that's a great addition to your fringe benefit portfolio. I just noticed a news article on one of the websites that I monitor today that talked about some states that are now requiring employers to automatically enroll employees in retirement plans, and the employee has to opt out rather than opt in order to try to stimulate a little more interest in retirement planning and those kinds of things. Excuse me. Obviously, insurance is a standard fringe benefit, but then we get into some of the things that farms may have to offer at a lower cost than perhaps other employers, a lower cost to the business. For example, I can cite several examples in our local community where a farming operation has bought a piece of ground that happened to have a house on it. Somebody used to farm, used to live there, has a house on it, still livable, could be fixed up for not too much money, or a mobile home could be moved in there, and all the other amenities are already there. So in many instances, a farm can offer housing at a lower cost for a particular employee than perhaps other businesses. Same for utilities, right there on the farm. Not that it's any lower cost, but maybe less hassle to get started. Farm produce, a little bit of beef, or a little bit of pork, or a little bit of other produce that we raise on the farm. Vehicle use quite often goes right with the farming operation. As long as you don't get carried away, you can use the farm vehicle to do a few other things that you need to do in your personal life, and it's not that big a deal. Hunting rights are a big one that we've found attractive in our area for potential employees. A lot of people like to hunt and are looking for a place to hunt. So if you have some excess hunting access on a few places that are not already spoken for, that can be a fringe benefit that a farm or ranch might be able to offer. That can make it such that we can get our total compensation package up there much more closely aligned with, say, our non-ag counterparts that may be able to offer a higher wage but may not have the ability to offer some of these other amenities. In some situations, motivation can be tied to pay directly. In other words, if you do a great job at this, you'll get an incentive or a bonus. Let's talk about that just a little bit so that we don't get carried away and think that that is the panacea or the cure to all motivational problems that we may have with getting employees to do something and do it well. Bonuses can be used to supplement base pay, improve productivity, increase employee retention, so on and so forth. However, bonuses only help increase labor productivity if they're closely tied to performance. In other words, don't just routinely start giving a bonus to everyone. Otherwise, it will soon become an expected part of the base salary. Everybody remembers Christmas Vacation, where the bonus had been paid for several years. There was an expectation that the bonus would be there, and it wasn't, and it caused all kinds of havoc, and ultimately it ended up getting paid in that case, of course. Incentive pay, pay for how the final outcome is impacted by this particular employee's performance. The key here is the employee has to have a lot of influence over the final outcome. Bonus based on units of a physical task, for example. Get this job done quickly, get this many units of output produced in an hour's time. If you can do better than that, we'll give you some kind of an incentive bonus or some kind of a piecework bonus. That may work very well because the employee can directly control that. Another example, an opposite example, bonus based on crop yield may not be very motivating because, especially in a state like Oklahoma or in the Southern Plains, actually anywhere, there are a lot of factors beyond the control of that individual employee that impact crop yield. I'm thinking about weather in particular, but other factors as well. So that employee may not have a whole lot to do, no matter how good of a job they do. They may not have a lot of direct impact on yield. So some keys here: the value of the output or the level of the output is sensitive to that employee's specific effort. May work if the employee is a risk taker, may not work very well if that particular employee is very risk averse. The level of risk that's beyond the employee's control is low. Again, how much impact does that employee's actions or effort have on the final outcome, and how certain is that? The employee's response to increased incentives is high. Does that employee have the personality to respond well in that environment? And then finally, not to be overlooked, that employee's contribution to the level of output can be measured, and can be measured at some reasonable cost. Again, works well in a factory where you're counting pieces of something completed or tasks completed. Certain farm related jobs may lend themselves well to that, but certainly not all. I believe that concludes our webinar for today.